Okay, we're going to be in Exodus 15 this morning. I think we pretty much covered the end of chapter 14 last week. So we'll move into a new chapter this week and maybe even get all the way through it. Who knows? Chapter 15, beginning in verse 1, we'll read through verse 18. Then Moses and the sons of Israel sang this song to the Lord and said, I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will extol him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has cast into the sea, and the choicest of his officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deeps cover them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, is majestic in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy. And in the greatness of your excellence, you overthrow those who rise up against you. You and send forth your burning anger, and it consumes them as chaff. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters were piled up. The flowing waters stood up like a heap. The deeps were congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall be granted or gratified against them. I will draw out my sword, my hand will destroy them. You blew with your wind, the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you among the gods, O Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in praises, working wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. In your loving kindness you have led the people whom you have redeemed. In your strength you have guided them to your holy habitation. The peoples have heard, they tremble. Anguish has gripped the inhabitants of Philistia. Then the chiefs of Edom were dismayed. The leaders of Moab trembling grips them. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them. By the greatness of your arm, they are motionless as stone, until your people pass over, O Lord, until the people pass over whom you have purchased. You will bring them and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. The Lord shall reign forever and ever. Sherry says hi. Hi to Sherry. Catchy tune, huh?
Well, they pretty well covered it, what happened up until that point. It's interesting also that evidently the peoples of the land around had heard of this scenario because of their fear of the Israelites.
Mm-hmm.
And towards the end there was Moab and Canaan and others.
Edom.
Had heard of what had gone on. So evidently the telegraph had got to them somehow.
They all got alerts on their cell phones.
Yeah, whatever, the cell phone is. Chicken alert or something. Whatever. It's interesting.
And in light of that, it's almost interesting that they paid more reference, more awe to God than the Israelite people did. Sometimes these people feared what was going on.
And sometimes when you're in the midst of what's going on, you don't have the best perspective because you're right in the middle of it, and people from on the outside can be better evaluators of what's going on. It's interesting, again, that they are convinced that their future enemies are going to be greatly impressed by this, but we know not too long down the road that they're scared to death of their enemies. So it's maybe they did get the message like they were supposed to. I don't know. I guess I was just maybe it was maybe a coincidence that I was kind of on the computer at the time, but I think I heard that the Japanese president, the former president of Japan, had been killed before he was even actually dead. It was just, I heard about the social media went out very quickly, and you could tell that he wasn't walking away from that. So, the word spread very quickly now. It spreads a little more slowly back then, but the Lord can make it happen and get the word out very quickly. And it's God not just winning this great victory over Egypt, but sending a message to the people that they are destined to encounter along the way in terms of this is what you're up against. This is who you're going to be fighting.
I don't know if it was mentioned here. Didn't they, when she does her songs, they bring out the tambourines and stuff. And I was thinking about how here they are fleeing Egypt. And granted, they plundered Egypt, but they brought their tambourines.
Somebody probably had a guitar too. I mean, that's the way that. I always have this, overwhelming sense of dread when I'm maybe, and this hasn't happened for a while, maybe for good reason, but when you're invited over to someone's house for a party or a dinner party or something like that, you get there and somebody gets out their guitar and you're like, oh no. But that's me. I mean, maybe other people are all excited to hear it. I don't know, but. There's an old saying, a gentleman is one who can play the accordion but doesn't. So Mark, that hurt his feelings. He's a big accordion fan.
We have a friend that's learning to play the accordion, and she tries to entertain us with a song or two, which is interesting.
It's hard to tell when an accordion's in tune or not, isn't it?
Well, there's a few squeaks in there.
Yeah. I know a lot of people really like them. I can't stand bagpipes. They absolutely, and that's my people, what they're doing all that, but I'm like, oh, that's so annoying. Who?
You don't.
I guess, dude.
The piano. She loved playing the piano. Mabel.
Did she play it well?
Honeycutt.
Did she play it well?
I don't know. I wasn't invited.
Okay.
You played that at the senior center. You played that mandolin.
Okay. Did she play that well?
I don't know. There was a whole group of them playing it. Who could tell?
We've got a lot of music aficionados here today. So it's okay. We've seen as the story of the Exodus has unfolded, we've seen the repeated pattern of Israel being oppressed, Israel crying out in their oppression. God responds first by word and then responds by deed. And God's actions, his word and his actions actually, are intended to elicit a human response, aren't they? When he talks to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's supposed to do something. Mainly, he's supposed to let the people go. He does not get the response he desires from Pharaoh. we could actually kind of condense all of that in these 2 chapters. You see, again, in chapter 14, we talked about the crossing of the Red Sea. You see Israel troubled, oppressed, trapped up against the sea, Egypt pressing down on them. They cry out. God gives them a word of comfort and then encouragement, and then delivers them from their dangerous situation. So that's in these 2 chapters that happened. And again, it is intended to elicit a human response. And the response desired by God from humans varies sometimes. Again, with Pharaoh, it was designed to get Pharaoh to let his people go. For Israel, it's always God's actions are designed somewhat to get obedience, but specifically to elicit praise, to get Israel to praise God, to worship God. So what God has done here, the actions he has done here, means Moses writes a song. We sing the song of Moses and the Lamb by and by, right? So God has acted. He's acted decisively. He's delivered Israel from an impossible situation. And now it is time for Israel to respond. In that response is worship or praise. And that is what God's going for here. And, God's actions, unlike we talked a little bit Sunday morning, just briefly, about these other gods of pagan religions like Thor and Zeus and all these. Only in Hollywood could Thor and Zeus hang out together, but that's fine. And if you read those portrayals, a lot of times those gods sound very, very human. They do things that sometimes should land them in jail or worse, and they have mistakes, they have flaws. The gods imagined by people are very human in their attributes. We believe we reflect God's image, right? And so the God does not reflect our attributes. We, to a very limited and in a very flawed way, reflect his attributes. So one of the differences is while these other pagan gods are very human sometimes and do bad things, the God of Israel has a very good reason for doing what he does. And what God does is act in the course of human events to alleviate a condition. And I think that's something maybe we have lost sight of in 21st century America, 20th century. Maybe we lost sight of it somewhere in the 19th or 20th century America. I'm not sure. I don't know about you, but I've heard kind of all my life when they talk about our founding fathers of this nation and how thoroughly Christian they were. And, you can look at some of their deeds and think, well, that wasn't very Christian of them. And in fact, a lot of times those deeds were very Christian, and that's the problem. The Christians do that kind of thing. It's not like Christ, but it's very Christian. But the founding fathers wrote a lot, and they talked a lot about religion. And their views would change. Most of them, guys like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and all these guys who lived a nice old age, wrote a lot, and their views would evolve over time. Their views would change. And it was based somewhat on the Bible as they had read it, and based somewhat on their observation and their experience in the world. It's hard to say that they would be what we would think were devout Christians. And that's, again, some of that's pretty obvious, I think, why. But they were convinced that, for the most part, that there was a God and that he had created the heavens and the earth. They were pretty much embodying on that. Like, this is God's creation in the world. And they were more convinced that a religion, any religion that's worth anything, creates good citizens, makes people be a good people. So there is a connectedness between religion and a desired outcome of the behavior of people. If people aren't, if there's no real benefit in the conduct of people, then their religion is worthless. So that's part of their thinking. That's very broad strokes and very probably ignoring some of them. It's hard to say that the founding fathers said this when there was a whole bunch of them and they all said a lot of different things. They all had a different axe to grind, really. And they were all from very different religious groups. I mean, the Southerners were mostly Methodists, the Methodists at the time. And then up north, you had Quakers. You had Benjamin Franklin was a Quaker. You had probably a lot of Episcopalian, what we would call, or Anglican. You had other variations of what was the Christian faith at the time. So,
Before you go too far, you were talking about the Christians are supposed to reflect God's characteristics, and that's where we run into trouble sometimes when we're trying to figure God out or how this happened or how that happened, is we try to put our attributes on God instead of, allowing God to be God. And God, all things are possible.
and we can see kind of in this situation where humans might interpret this story as to justify going out to war against somebody, whereas the story is stand still. I will fight for you. And then you can take that even if they get that part kind of right. I mean, when the story of the Native Americans is not my expertise, but the vast majority of Indians that died in the wake of the European colonists arriving were not killed by guns or battles. They were killed by disease. They caught our diseases and they had no immunity to them and they died. They get a head cold. We didn't even bring COVID with us, at that point. So, they get a head cold or a flu or something and they just would wipe out a whole village or whatever. And the Christians that were coming over would see this and think, this is God fighting for us. This is God making a way, parting the Red Sea, I guess you could say, not to be too politically incorrect. Not that I usually worry about that, but it's we're the chosen people arriving in this new land of milk and honey, and there's all these people in the way, and God is just taking them right out for us. That was one way of looking at it, and that's each step is not exactly what's happening. I mean, the thing about when Israel sees God act on their behalf, is there any doubt who is doing it? I mean, it doesn't happen because somebody gets sick and dies. It happens because the laws of nature are suspended. God acts beyond the realm of nature. He acts supernaturally to deliver Israel from Egyptian bondage here. So, we have to really, I think, be careful, and how we understand these stories really matter. But it is, this song is in a sense, Israel beating its chest. Look what God has done for us, but it is also mostly praising God for what he has done rather than what we did. And it will have, it is intended to have, a message for the other peoples they will encounter. And they will have to go out and fight them themselves. But to kind of look at this story, you can take it in a lot of different ways. And most of them are wrong, probably. But, this is Israel's story, I think. And we plug and play it into our life at our own peril, really. And we need to rejoice, I think, in what God did for his people then, and think maybe in a more spiritual way as to how God delivers us from oppression now. And rather than killing the Egyptians to deliver those oppressed now, God gave up his son to deliver people who are oppressed now, who are oppressed by sin now. So the Red Sea is the blood and water that poured out of Jesus Christ. So it's all connected. I mean, I guess that's what I'm really trying to hammer home here. It's not acting out of nowhere, not acting arbitrarily. Just God doesn't like Egypt, or God just does it and doesn't even know what he's doing, doesn't care what he's doing. It is God responding to their plight, and he wants them to respond to his action. And we will now, I guess, if you're ready, we'll move on to the Song of Miriam. Okay.
In verse 13, it's like you've led by your steadfast love the people who you have redeemed, and you've guided them by your strength to your holy abode. And I think that so much reflects what Jesus has done for us and how the Holy Spirit leads us, the people who have been purchased or redeemed by him. And so there was a purpose for the conquering of sin, just as if you look at Egypt and the Egyptians as being sin, to, you know what I mean, they were completely swallowed up with the Egyptians. And so there's a conquering of sin and a redeeming of the people that he loves, and a leading them and guiding them, just as there is today.
Yeah. It's an important point that he redeems them out of Egyptian captivity and into his habitation, as if, even though they're not in the promised land yet when the song was written or sang. So many Americans have this definition of freedom as being, I can do whatever I want. That's what freedom is. And that is one, I guess, way of looking at freedom. But the biblical concept of liberation from oppression is to be taken out of the bondage of sin, the worldly forces, and to become a citizen of God's kingdom under his authority, under his reign. We are brought into his house. He doesn't just get Israel out of Egypt. He is in the process now of bringing Israel into Canaan, into their promised land. And so it kind of corrects this notion, I think, of because God has saved me or redeemed me, I can do whatever I want. Now I have a total freedom. And, there's a lot of folks who profess faith and they talk about it's very personal. I have a personal relationship with God. And you should have a personal relationship with God, but it's not to be an individual relationship with God. It's to be shared within the habitation, within the community of God's people. And it's not a relationship designed to let you do whatever you want. That's not the point. And we all have to live in a community. We all have to make some sacrifices and take responsibility. And sometimes what happens with the society, and I think maybe we're seeing this now, as a culture degrades, you get all these manifestations of evil because they're not fully brought into the culture. They're just taking what they want out of it, and that's it. Yes, ma'am.
Even in the worldly sense, freedom isn't completely I can do whatever I want, because my freedom ends where yours begin, or your freedom ends where my freedom begins. So even in the worldly sense, it's not a complete, I can do what I want.
Yes.
Anarchy.
Well, it shouldn't be. I think we've refined that from maybe the kind of love generation of the 60s and 70s, where they really did want the freedom to basically do whatever they wanted to do. And I'm okay, you're okay kind of thing. And that's been refined and maybe obliterated by the same folks who were screaming for freedom 50 years ago are now the biggest enemies of freedom, it seems like sometimes. But we still kind of all have to live together. And if we want to live in a free society, we have to acknowledge the fact that some people will abuse the freedom. If they're only free to do what we think they should do, then they're not really free, are they? And if we were only free to do what they think we should do, we wouldn't be free, would we? But at the same time, there has to be citizenship. There has to be investment. And I think a sense of distinction between the citizens and, the rest of the world. Not that you want to look down your nose or think worse about them, but instead of saying, well, in this country they do this, maybe you can learn from that, but that's not this country. They don't have the history we have. They don't have the resources we have. They don't have the people we have. That doesn't mean we're better than them. It may mean in some ways we're worse than them. But it's certainly going to mean we're different than them. And, we can, I think, sometimes learn from other cultures and everything, but sometimes they're flawed too. So it's easy to cherry pick these other countries and say, well, they never have this problem, or they make this available to everybody and okay, well, what about this? There's a offset to that usually. I'm glad to be an American, and I don't know that I could really even survive in a long term in another country, but it doesn't mean it's perfect. And if you don't love America, warts and all, then you don't really love America, do you? If you don't love your wife because she's 4'11", if you think she's 5'3", well, you don't really love your wife, do you? If she's 4'11", so you love someone else. So, but you have to love people, and you love things as they are. And we have to love the church for its imperfections too. We can acknowledge shortcomings and flaws. There's certainly God's people here have flaws, and there is still the sense that they are God's people. And God loves them, and God redeemed them. So, any other thoughts before we move on to what really probably is better understood as simply still part of Moses' song, but it's kind of presented as a separate song, Miriam. Verses 19 through 21. For the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and his horsemen went into the sea, and the Lord brought back the waters of the sea on them. But the sons of Israel walked on dry land in the midst of the sea. Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took the timbrel, and all the women went on after her with timbrels and went dancing. And with dancing. And Miriam answered them, sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and his rider he has hurled into the sea. So there's kind of this thought that maybe originally what was going on was the men might sing one part and the women answer, and maybe they sing something else and the men answer. It's kind of a back and forth thing going on. But this is, it's a part of their worship. It's what they're doing, and they are reacting and retelling the story of what God did for them in the crossing of the Red Sea. It's their way of commemorating it and teaching it to subsequent generations. Again, if we want to put it in our context, it's kind of what we do when we take the Lord's Supper. We talk about usually the context of the original Last Supper or Lord's Supper of the upper room and the disciples and Jesus' words and actions around it. We don't emulate it precisely, but we do kind of an impression of it. We try to capture the spirit of it, the idea of it, and use it as a teaching moment. I don't know if any of y'all in here have seen the movie The Music Man, the old musical. That's kind of me and Sherry's movie. It's the story of a virtuous librarian pursued by a smooth talking huckster. So that's me and Sherry. I'll let you guess which one is which. But one of the things that's going on, he's in this little town in Iowa, River City, I guess, and it's right around the 4th of July. And they're going to have a retelling of the last days of Pompeii for whatever reason. The city that got covered in volcanic ash and everything when Vesuvius blew up. And it's all the kind of leading ladies of the town, the mayor's wife and some of the other older and matriarchal figures and they're going to go out and they do a little dance and everything in their little costumes, kind of homemade costumes with their little kids sneakers on, and they rehearse it and they practice it and all that. And that's kind of what's happening here. It's not just a ceremony randomly chosen, evidently. I don't know what Pompeii, or he called it Pompeii, and now I can't get it out of my head. But the last days, why that would be relevant to the people of River City, Iowa. But this is very relevant to the people of Israel. And these women are playing a big part in telling Israel's story to the people. And we've already talked about how sometimes when you're in the midst of something going on, it's hard to really understand it. Well, maybe with some time and some space and seeing it reacted or reenacted in a simplified version when you're not facing imminent destruction, it starts to maybe make a little more sense. This is how we're going to tell the story. And this is, I think, one of the really beautiful things about Exodus, and that the Exodus narrative itself, them leaving, Israel leaving Egypt, is bounded, both sides, by empowered women acting to save the day or to tell the story again. And one of those women on both sides of the story is Miriam. Right? I mean, how does Moses even survive the genocide that is being wreaked on Israel at the time? His mother, Miriam, the midwives, Pharaoh's daughter, those women save Moses. The most powerful man in the world is trying to kill Moses, and God puts Moses in the hands of those who have no power, but God empowers them to do what he wants them to do. And then after this great event has occurred, it is Miriam that is telling the story with these women, and they're shaking their tambourines and dancing, and they're not just instrumental music and all that, they're dancing. And that's not always maybe the most welcome practice and worship, but here it's what they're doing. David, when he's bringing the ark out, bringing up to Jerusalem, David goes before the ark dancing. And his wife says, "You're making a fool out of yourself. You don't ever want to dance with me," whatever it was. And what happens to her? She gets shut off. She's Saul's daughter, and she's no more, really. She's cloistered after that, basically. So Israel's worship, we have our worship, and it's very ordered, and it's nice and calm. Everybody knows what's happening. Usually, you can understand what's being said, and it's easy to go ahead and you got awakened a little bit early that morning, so let me make up those 10 minutes right now. I'll get a little more sleep here. You haven't dozed off at church. You haven't been at church very much. Israel's worship was very different than ours. Animals are being slaughtered, for one thing. It smells. They may have become more or less so used to that smell that they don't even notice it. But there's the crying out of the animals. There's the mess of the animals. It's a very engaging activity. It's not just sitting there in a nice, comfortable auditorium and comfortable seats and watching someone else do something. Even though they had a high priest who was really doing all the heavy lifting, the rest of the congregation was fully engaged and involved. So it's a different experience than we have. I wonder what they would think if they came to see our worship service now. I don't know if they could stay awake during it either, but it's telling a story, and that's the one of the, not the only, but one of the important parts of worship is to tell the story of what God has done. It's not simply to tell the story, but it is in part to tell the story. It's to express gratitude and praise God for what he has done. Say thank you, but also how great God is for what he is able to do. So any other thoughts? We're about to close the Exodus narrative. What do you think from Exodus 1 up to this passage right here? Any thoughts on that?
But it's like you said, basically they're retelling what happened and why it happened. It was the Lord that did these things for them. And a lot of history is people retelling what went on before. It's before we got to the point where we write everything down or whatever. It's like listening to my father talk about his childhood and what he did. And those are memories that I have that are not down in this kind of the same kind of deal with the Israelites here. Both men and women. I guess, when he talks about Moses writing this original, and then Miriam and her song. So they've covered all the bases, basically.
So it's the story. It's a big story. It's something they look back for the rest of their
even today,
time. And yes, and what the wilderness wanderings, the conquest, are still very important about getting Israel into the promised land. It doesn't go all that well. It doesn't go smoothly, and it doesn't go completely. It certainly doesn't go exactly to God's plans, but it does go forward. But Israel's remembering, while they do remember the wanderings, while they do remember the conquest, the primary thing they focus on, the primary thing they bring to mind in distress is the Exodus itself. When they think about the Exodus, they think about being brought. We cried out to God in our suffering, and God delivered us. And this is Israel telling the story. The Egyptians would probably have a different take on some of this. And what we see is sometimes, again, in America, we have co-opted this story. We told our story for a long time. That was us, all the kind of standard, how great America is, a perfect nation and all that. That was us telling our story for a long time. But when you have a nation that supposedly prides itself on integrating people from other cultures into the fabric of the nation, what happens is they get to tell their story too. And they get to say, okay, you said this, but this is what really happened. If every Native American on the continent had been killed, we would not have any pushback on the idea, the notion that what they did, that what the Westerners did when they got here was less than perfect. Israel at some point is going to get some pushback. And they do. They're living with pushback right now, aren't they? But they're telling their story, and this is them telling their story in the context of what future generations, their own people will think, and also what the Philistines, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Canaanites will all think about it as well. The people that they will be dispossessing. So it's fine. Israel gets to tell their story, and that's what's happening here. So we need to keep that in mind. Okay. Thank you for your attention and comments. We'll pick up there next week, verse 22. It's really a big different change anyway, so it's a good breaking point, and we'll get into that and probably well into chapter 16 next week. So thank you for your attention and comments. Mr. Cole, will you lead us in closing prayer, please?